Welcome, bold seekers and thinkers, to the podcast series Insurrectionist Ethics by OPP of oxfordpublicphilosophy.com. OPP is a student-originated educational space for questioning what philosophy is and how we're doing it in form and content. These episodes are taken from lectures for our first asynchronous online course based upon Professor Lee A. McBride III's book Ethics and Insurrection, A Pragmatism for the Oppressed. This introduction to a McBridean take on insurrectionist ethics also serves as an alternative inlet to topics and thinkers found within traditional Eurocentric curricula and those you may be less acquainted with. You can find a plurality of voices in lectures and resources at oxfordpublicphilosophy.com, and we welcome any conversation at oxfordpublicphilosophy@gmail.com. We thank the American Philosophical Association for their support. Prepare to venture forth with us, quote, to form new coalitions and bonds of trust to engage in those forms of collective action likely to shape a better future. This is our task. Ethics and Insurrection, A Pragmatism for the Oppressed.
Hello, my name is Greg Moses. My pronouns are he, him. I am recording this talk on indigenous lands of the Tonkawa. I have been teaching philosophy since 1988. My philosophical work focuses on the philosophy of nonviolence, especially as developed by Martin Luther King Jr., and I am humbled to be the recipient of the William R. Jones Award conferred by the Philosophy Born of Struggle Conference. I currently serve as editor of the Acorn, Philosophical Studies in Pacifism and Nonviolence. Over the years, I have drawn a lot of inspiration from the work of the Nobel Prize-winning songwriter Bob Dylan. I recommend two songs in relation to today's talk. When we discuss the lion spirit, I would play a soundtrack of the song Arthur McBride, featuring Dylan's cover of Paul Brady. And when we mention the transformation of the lion spirit into the child, I would recommend Dylan's My Back Pages, especially as it appears on two YouTube videos. One of them shows the song being rehearsed for the 30th anniversary celebration of Dylan's first album. The second video shows the live performance featuring Dylan, Roger McGuinn, Tom Petty, Eric Clapton, Neil Young, and George Harrison. The image behind me is filtered from a Wikimedia Commons photo taken by Daniel Ziegler of a Black Lives Matter rally at the Texas Capitol on June 7th, 2020. Today, we will take a look at 5 texts posted as readings for Week 2, Sitting 2 of the Oxford Public Philosophy course on Insurrectionist Ethics. The texts are Chapter 3, New Descriptions, New Possibilities, from Lee McBride's book, Ethics and Insurrection. A chapter from the Leonard Harris Reader on Honor and Insurrection. Ian Hacking's chapter on Making Up People from the 1986 book, Reconstructing Individualism. A journal article by Robert Gooding Williams on race, multiculturalism, and democracy. And Nietzsche's on the genealogy of morality. I will offer a reading of the text and then pose some questions for discussion. In Chapter 3 of Ethics and Insurrection, A Pragmatism for the Oppressed, the author tells the story of his Black American great-grandfather who fought his way out of a general store in Mississippi, escaped a lynch mob, fled the state, and reestablished his life under the new family name, McBride. Lee McBride III says that family stories like this, quote, afforded me descriptions of proud, indignant Black forefathers. When met with racism or injustice, they took a posture of resistance. They challenged the racial apartheid, the racist terrors of the time, end quote. McBride goes on to say, quote, "Whether true or fictional, such descriptions opened new possibilities for me. They allow me to imagine myself a lion's spirit, more confident and less afraid to flare with indignation when met with injustice," end quote. When McBride imagines himself as a lion, he is referring to an early passage in Thus Spake Zarathustra, where three metamorphoses of spirit are presented. The spirit becomes a camel, then a lion, and then a child. In the metamorphosis between camel and lion, the load-bearing camel goes into the wilderness and becomes a lion. Quote, "Freedom will it capture, and lordship," end quote. As a load-bearing camel, it had followed the law of thou shalt. But when the camel changes into a lion, it assumes the law of I will. It is, quote, "forced to find illusion and arbitrariness even in the holiest things, that it may capture freedom from its love," end quote. Finally, the lion becomes a child. The child is innocent and forgetful, the better to begin, quote, "a new game, a self-rolling wheel," end quote, creating its own will and its own world. McBride's chapter on new descriptions says philosophy has a twofold role: to, quote, "critically assess the descriptions of oppressed groups that contribute to those groups remaining disempowered, and to creatively articulate new descriptions that offer new possibilities and direct oppressed groups toward liberation," end quote. The story of his grandfather becoming Grandfather McBride by fighting, fleeing, and starting a new life is an example of the kind of description that McBride is looking for. Leonard Harris describes, quote, "the character traits that enliven David Walker's famous appeal. While others may praise abolitionists such as Henry Lloyd Garrison or Frederick Douglass, Harris argues that, quote, "the character traits exhibited by David Walker, such as tenacity, irreverence, passion, enmity, and the associated actions of insurrection, are due esteem. Insurrectionists, with their absolute belligerence and disdain for slavery's authorities, were magnanimous in ways different from abolitionists that relied on moral suasion to change civil and government behavior," end quote. David Walker's pamphlet, published in 3 editions between 1829 and 1830, made a Christian-based argument that, quote, "the blacks or colored people are treated more cruel by the white Christians of America than devils themselves ever treated a set of men, women, and children on this earth," end quote. What have black people done to white people that would provoke such punishment as the institution of American slavery? Quote, "I have been for years troubling the pages of historians to find out what our fathers have done to the white Christians of America to merit such condign punishment as they inflicted on them and do continue to afflict on us, their children. But I must aver that my researches have hitherto been to no effect. I have therefore come to the immovable conclusion that they Americans have and do continue to punish us for nothing else but for enriching them and their country," end quote. Walker, who lives in a world governed by a just God, predicts that an awful judgment will come, very likely in the form of a civil war that will cause white people to kill each other in large numbers. Walker is especially outraged by a newspaper story of 60 people who were purchased at a slave auction in Kentucky. As they were traveling down the road, some of the men got loose from their chains and fought for their freedom. 2 men in charge of the transport were killed, and a third one left for dead. But when the third slave driver recovered his senses, One of the women in the group helped him onto a horse, and he was able to get help. Everyone was recaptured, men, women, and children. Walker observes that, quote, there is a solemn awe in the hearts of the blacks as it respects murdering men, which is the reason the whites take advantage of us, end quote. And he denounces the woman who helped the slave driver escape. Slave keepers are the enemies of the Lord, and they ought to be destroyed. Quote, any person who will save such wretches from destruction is fighting against the Lord and will receive his just recompense, end quote. In support of his argument that slaveholders should be destroyed, Walker submits the text of the July 4th Declaration of Independence. Quote, all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, end quote. Legend tells us that David Walker's insurrectionist spirit inhabited John Brown as he planned and executed his attack of the U.S. arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in 1859. The arsenal was defended by townspeople and militia, driving John Brown and his small band of insurgents into a fire station, where they were eventually captured by Army Colonel Robert E. Lee. John Brown was hanged 6 weeks later. In a famous meeting prior to the raid, the insurrectionist John Brown sat down with the abolitionist Frederick Douglass and pleaded with him to join in. As we know, Douglass declined. Frederick Douglass is considered to be in the moral suasionist category of activism. As Harris describes them, quote, moral suasionists believe that the power of moral argument, particularly arguments that emphasize Christian moral requirements, could persuade persons to radically change their behavior. In addition, suasionists believed that if they or members of the enslaved racial ethnic type demonstrated enviable character traits, the demonstration would help convince government and civil authorities of the humanity or potential humanity of the slave community, end quote. As we have seen already, insurrectionists called for the destruction of slavery and slaveholders outright. As McBride argues in his second tenet, insurrectionist ethics supports, quote, advocating a conception of personhood that militates moral action against obvious injustice or brutality, justifying militancy and radical action on behalf of oppressed peoples, end quote. In the words of Harris, insurrectionist ethics advocates a conception of the personhood such that, quote, the virtues of tenacity, irreverence, passion, and enmity were features of full human persons, and they could be instrumental in ending slavery, end quote. Harris also points out that abolitionists and insurrectionists shared different visions of their ultimate goal. Abolitionists called for a more egalitarian arrangement of relationships across society. Insurrectionists just wanted to end slavery. That's it. But social goals will be the subject of another sitting. Today, we are chiefly concerned with conceptions of personhood. Harris extends the work of Bernard Boxall to argue that militancy is required as a ground of honor and self-respect. But the system of slavery precludes honoring enslaved persons as a class, denying them the freedoms of family relationships, and excluding them from social acknowledgments of, quote, trust, empathy, admiration, and obedience, end quote. Therefore, the system of slavery and its vestiges constitutes a morally insulting system that justifies all the enmity that insurrectionists can muster against it. If people want to counter that insurrection is unwise because it is unlikely to succeed, Harris replies that insurrections rarely have odds in their favor. Therefore, justification of insurrection cannot be sought from either, quote, a phenomenologist, existentialist, nominalist, rationalist, empiricist, or utilitarian, end quote. Walker's deeply Christian justification for insurrection comes from the very demand of personhood itself. As Harris puts it, quote, there is an a priori, apodictically knowable structure of personhood that should be mirrored in each person's life. Self-ownership of one's labor, family bonds, and the ability to transfer assets across generations are definitive of full personhood. Any system that does not satisfy these a priori demands is a system that deserves to be destroyed. Says Harris, quote, actual revolutionaries and insurrectionists are driven by a sense of deep-seated responsibility to take unfathomable and unrewarded risks, end quote. On this view, David Walker and John Brown were genuine activists, while Frederick Douglass was a mere observer. The ethical difference between John Brown and Frederick Douglass is that they held, quote, different conceptions of honorable character traits and warranted forms of representation. Douglass was right in his perception that an attack on Harper's Ferry would occasion a response by the federal government, and right about the unlikelihood of its success. He was wrong if he thought that Brown should not attack, end quote. We should honor the example of insurrectionists. Quote, there should be plaques, awards, statues, monuments, honoraria, schools, churches, and children named after insurrectionists, end quote. Modern-day insurrectionists should therefore, quote, pursue assets and take control of their lives using the same means as every individual or group in human history, including subterfuge, guile, disdain, and belligerence toward maniacal and malicious authorities, end quote. The insurrectionist ethics of McBride and Harris resonate well with Nietzsche's analysis of the will to power in his 1887 essays on the genealogy of morals. Trained as a philologist or expert in ancient languages, Nietzsche cautioned his readers to understand where the word good comes from. Good is what ancient ruling classes called themselves, especially to distinguish themselves from, quote, the dark-colored and above us all the black-haired pre-Aryan inhabitants of the Italian soil, whose complexion formed the clearest features of distinction from the dominant blondes, namely the Aryan conquering race, whose knightly aristocratic values are based on a careful cult of the physical, on a flowering, rich, and even effervescing healthiness that goes considerably beyond what is necessary for maintaining life, on war, adventure, the chase, the dance, the tourney, on everything, in fact, which is contained in strong, free, and joyous action, end quote. The good and the true are words that people name themselves who are capable of exercising a superior power over others. Is this a fearful power that is exercised by the, quote, beast of prey or aristocratic blonde brute, end quote? Well, yes, but, quote, who would not 100 times prefer to be afraid when one at the same time admires than to be immune from fear at the cost of being perpetually obsessed with the loathsome spectacle of the distorted, the dwarfed, the stunted, the envenomed, end quote. Insurrectionists may inspire fear, but they refuse to contort their a priori humanity into the, quote, bad conscience of the resentful man, the reacting man, end quote. Rather, they take up the source of true and good law that is laid down by the, quote, active, strong, spontaneous, aggressive man, end quote. Laws which are, quote, subordinated to the life will's general end, that is, as a means to greater, larger units of strength. Nietzsche's analysis of power was an influence upon the work of Michel Foucault, who in turn influenced Ian Hacking. Hacking's, quote, dynamic nominalism, end quote, asserts that descriptions shape the possibilities of who we can become. Foucault famously demonstrated how the description of homosexuality emerged as a social force in the 19th century, making necessary the counter-descriptions articulated by gay rights and queer theory. Robert Gooding Williams applies Hacking's insight to the social construction of race and racism. Just as the descriptions of Black people by white supremacists have sustained socially constructed racist practices and stereotypes, so also may anti-racists respond with creative descriptions that enable what Susan Wolf calls a, quote, politics of recognition, end quote. The point of this work for insurrectionist ethics is the emphasis that it places upon the power of description and the complex use of that power. In sum, David Walker's appeal could be read as David Walker's description, and David Walker's description could be read as a primer on the insurrectionist ethics of description. David Walker described a system that ought to be destroyed, and he objected to any description that would refuse to destroy it. Flipping the mirror around so that we are no longer looking at the slave system, we turn to the personhood of David Walker himself, and we find that an insurrectionist ethics of personhood demands the freedom to remake the world according to, quote, an a priori, apodictically knowable structure of personhood that seeks self-ownership of one's labor, family bonds, and the ability to transfer assets across generations. Now that we have shared a reading of the text for this sitting, here are 14 or 15 questions you may want to discuss. Was it wrong to say that the cruelty of American slavery was the worst example in history? Was it wrong to hold Christianity responsible for American slavery? Is it wrong to say that the institution of slavery in America should have been destroyed at the earliest possible opportunity? Is it wrong to say that condemnation of such a system requires no justification beyond something like an a priori assertion of personhood? Is some other justification required? Is it wrong to say that John Brown did the right thing? Is it wrong to call Frederick Douglass a spectator? How do the comportments of insurrectionist ethics compare to the cardinal virtues of faith, hope, love, wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice? How would you devise a list of cardinal virtues that represent insurrectionist ethics? Would you carry forward any of the traditional cardinal virtues? If we adopt Nietzsche's account of the genealogy of morals, is there any approach to power that does not require an underclass? If we adopt a concept of freedom to comport with insurrectionist ethics, how does that concept of freedom compare with the freedom of Nietzsche's blonde brutes? What role do descriptions play in support of systems of oppression today? What role do descriptions play in resistance to systems of oppression today? Do our descriptions of resistance fall prey to Nietzsche's diagnosis of resentment? How does one destroy a description? In my remarks today, I have attempted to give a concise and sympathetic account of certain texts which I hope will be of some use to students. I do not claim that this is the only way to describe those texts, and I encourage each listener to explore what those texts mean for themselves. However, while my reading may differ from yours, as I hope it will, I do request that any descriptions at this point should be fairly put, representing what the late Thich Nhat Hanh called deep listening. I am a scholar of King's Nonviolence and the editor of a journal on pacifism and nonviolence. If you happen to share these interests, I just want to emphasize that a secure path to King's Nonviolence will travel through these texts and the questions they raise, not around them. Thank you for inviting me to share these remarks today. Take care.
Thank you for listening and thinking deeply beyond that offered in the classroom. You can find other episodes on Oxford Podcasts, its outlets, oxfordpublicphilosophy.com, and our YouTube. Special thanks to our lecturers, Professor McBride, and our team.
Content editor, Beatrice Marchegiani.
Tech and audio editor, Shreya Rajesh.
Graphic designer, Zed Knott.
And course designer and organiser, Alice Hank Wynnum. Wishing you philosophical mischief.